now presents Parliament Live, bringing our nation and its leaders together.
Direct and guide us in all our consultations. And grant that, we having thy fear always before our eyes, and laying aside all private interest, prejudices, and partial affections, the result of all our counsels may be to the glory of thy blessed name, the maintenance of true religion and justice, the safety, honor, and happiness of the Queen, the public weal, peace and tranquility of the island, and the uniting and knitting together of all the hearts of all persons and their states within the same, in true Christian love and charity, one towards another, through Jesus Christ, O Lord. Amen.
Honourable House now resume its sitting. Call of the roll.
Mr. Witter? Mr. Smith? Mr. Holness? Mr. Shaw? Dr. Chang? Mr. Samuda? Mr. Montague? Mrs. Grange? Mr. Henry, Mr. Bartlett, Mr. Mackenzie, Mr. Chuck, Mr. Daryl Vaz, Mr. Warmington, Mrs. Robinson, Mr. Hutchinson, Mr. Wheatley, Dr. Wheatley, Dr. Tufton,
members.
Mrs. Malone-Fort, Mr. Spencer.
Could you retrieve that flag for me, please?
Mr. Williams.
Flag. It's a flag.
Come in. Leave Mr. Terilyn that for me. Mr.
Continue,
Spencer,
please.
Mrs. Williams, Mr. Green, Mr. Arscott, Mr. Azan, Dr. Bloomfield, Mr. Brown, Mr. Buchanan, Mr. Bunting, Dr. Campbell, Mr. Campbell, Mr. Clark, Mrs. Cuthbert Finn, Miss Daly, Mr. Daly, Mrs. Dalrymple Philibert, Mr. Fagan, Mr. Ferguson, Dr. Ferguson, Dr. Guy, Miss Hannah, Mr. Hales, Mrs. Holness, Mr. Hilton, Mr. Jackson, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Main, Dr. McNeil, Miss Nita, Mr. Paulwell, Mr. Phillips, Dr. Phillips, Mr. Pickersgill, Mr. Redman, Mr. Robertson, Mr. Robinson, Mr. Stewart, Mr. Terilyn, Reverend Thwaites, Mr. Dwayne Vaz, Mr. Wright, Mr. Samuda, Mr. Chuck, Mrs. Robinson, Mr. Montague. Present.
Members, before we proceed, order please. Before we proceed, I wish to recognize a number of visitors. The new ambassador from Cuba, Ambassador Fernandez, a number of schools, high schools, the Montego Bay High School, Jamaica University, Nuggerhead Primary, and Gregory Park. We welcome you here and ask you to follow the proceedings as was outlined to you by the security when you arrive. Thank you. Statement by ministers. Announcements.
Laid on the table of the House today are the following. Ministry Paper number 65 of 2017 entitled 9th Replenishment of the Special Development of the Caribbean Development Bank, CDB. Annual Report and Financial Statements of the Jamaica Information Service for the year 2014-2015. Annual Report of the Chase Fund for the financial year 2015-2016. Annual Report on Audited Financial Statements for the Jamaica Social Investment Fund for the year 2015-2016. And the Auditor General Review of the Fiscal Policy Paper for the financial year 2017-2018. Interim report.
Bills brought from the Senate.
The following is a message from the President of the Senate. To the Honourable House of Representatives, I have the honour to advise the Honourable House of Representatives that on the 20th day of October 2017, a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Processed Food Act and the Processed Food General Regulations 1959 was passed in the Senate without amendment. Signed, Thomas Tavares Finson, QC CDJP, President of the Senate.
Petitions, papers, reports from committees, notices of motions given orally.
Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Terilyn.
Yes. If it so pleases you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg to give notice that at the next meeting of the House, I will move the following motion. Whereas this Honourable House has, for the past 8 years, approved a motion in support of Cuba's resolution submitted to the United Nations General Assembly entitled Necessity of Ending the Economic, Commercial and Financial Embargo Imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. And whereas the 55-year-old policy of economic blockade remains in place despite the fact that 191 member states of the United Nations, including Jamaica, and representing the vast majority of the international community, voted last year in favor of the resolution. And whereas, despite the March 2016 measure authorizing the use of the United States dollar in international transactions, there are still no normal banking relations between Cuba and the United States, and with implications for relations with the international banking system. And whereas the increased prosecution of Cuba's international financial transactions, including those coming from multilateral organizations for cooperation with the island, has been one of the distinctive features in the implementation of the blockade policy under the current U.S. administration. And whereas the Office of Foreign Assets Control of the Department of the Treasury is the vehicle used to investigate and prosecute those who establish or may consider establishing normal relations with Cuba. And whereas the immigration policy of the U.S. regarding Cuba has narrowly changed despite the removal of Cuba from the list of state sponsors of terrorism and the establishment of diplomatic relations in 2015, and as there is continued denial of claims for reparation for losses due to the blockade and continued occupation of Guantanamo Bay, and despite the restoration of regular commercial air service in August 2016, tourism from the U.S. to Cuba effectively remains illegal. And whereas the United States administration on the 8th of September 2017 extended the application against Cuba of the Trading with the Enemy Act until September 14, 2018, thus keeping in place the legal framework in which the policy of blockade against Cuba of 1962 is based. And whereas the United States administration in June 2017 announced new restrictive measures on travel and trade with Cuba, thereby further tightening the blockade and reversing key elements of the 14th of October 2016 Presidential Policy Directive, normalization of relations between U.S. and Cuba. And whereas the blockade is a violation of international law and is contrary to the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter and to the norms governing international trade and freedoms of navigation, as well as constituting a transgression of the right to peace, development, and security of a sovereign state, and which, in its essence and its aims, continues to be an act of unilateral aggression and a permanent threat against the stability of a member country of the United Nations. And whereas international humanitarian laws prohibit any embargo on raw materials for food and medicine, even in wartime, and Cuba continues to be unable to trade even food and medicine with subsidiaries of U.S. companies in third-party countries. And whereas the economic, commercial, and financial blockade imposed by the United States against Cuba remains in force and continues to be a main obstacle to the economic and social development of Cuba and to its recovery from the effects of the global recession and natural disasters. And whereas Jamaica's own national interests are concerned with the impact of the continuation of the blockade and the extraterritorial application of U.S. laws regulating transactions between Jamaica and Cuba directly and indirectly. And whereas governments committed to the norms of the multilateral trading system, to the freedom of trade and navigation, to the principles of the Charter of the United Nations, to international law, and to the rejection of the extraterritorial application of a national law, are expected to vote on the 1st of November 2017 in favor of the draft resolution at the United Nations General Assembly. Be it resolved that this Honourable House expresses itself on matters relating to the morality, legality, and desirability of this decades-old blockade against Cuba and gives support to a renewed dialogue between the U.S. and Cuba, and to the government of Jamaica in putting forward Jamaicans' position today, Tuesday, October 31st, in support of the anticipated adoption of the resolution. Mr. Speaker, I further beg to give notice that at a later stage today, I will move for the suspension of the standing orders to enable me to take this motion. Mr. Speaker, I know. Mr. Speaker, while ignoring the banter from across the floor, were I able to speak in a foreign language in this Honourable House, Mr. Speaker, I would say to the Ambassador and to the people of Cuba que estamos aquí en Jamaica, le da el apoyo para siempre, hasta la victoria y hasta la justicia para ti y para toda la gente de Cubana, nuestros hermanos y compañeros aquí en el Caribe.
Order. Questions?
Mr. Speaker, at your pleasure, at the next meeting of the House, I beg to move the following motion. Be it resolved that this Honourable House consider ways and means to improve the stability of family life in Jamaica.
Questions and answers to questions. Motions that may be made at the commencement of public business requiring notice. Motions relating to the sittings of the House. Motions for leave to introduce bills. Presentation of bills without leave of the House first obtained. Public business. Minister.
Mr. Speaker, on the public business today, we deal with the resolution and embargo on Cuba. We continue debating the bill shortly entitled the Bill in Act 2017. The bill shortly entitled the Major Organized Crime and Anti-Corruption Agency Act 2017. And we continue debate and the constituent debate. Today we'll have the member from North East St. Andrew, Honourable Delrod Truck, the member for Northern Clarendon, Mr. Horace Daly, the member for St. Elizabeth Northwestern, Honourable J.C. Hutchinson, the member for St. Catherine East Central, Mr. Orlando Terilyn, and the member from St. Anne Northwest, Dr. Dayton Campbell, making their presentation. Now, Mr. Terilyn will now open the debate on the Cuba resolution.
No, what am I doing now? No, I thought I'm doing the...
Mr. Terilyn, you are required to move the suspension of standing order.
Yes. Mr. Speaker, I now move for the suspension of the standing orders to enable me to take the motion, notice of which I gave earlier.
Those in favor? Aye. Those against? As of it.
Mr. Speaker, I now ask for the motion to be approved.
Those in favor? Mr. Terilyn, it's an indication that other members would want to make a cut. And
yes. Okay.
Mr. Terilyn, having made your presentation,
Mr. Speaker, the motion raised in this Honourable House today is of extreme importance to every single nation state. In particular, Mr. Speaker, as it touches and concerns the questions of self-determination, the right of people to choose their own government, and the right of every nation to make choices in the best interest of its people. Mr. Speaker, for far too long, the people of Cuba have suffered and have endured under an illegal and oppressive system which sees one nation state treating the people of Cuba as though they were pawns in an illegal international realm of blockades old embargo on trade and normalization of relations which have no place in the modern global village. Mr. Speaker, to credit to the memory of Fidel Castro and Che Guevara, who fought for the liberation of the Cuban people against the tyranny of an external state, the people of Cuba still suffer and pay the price. Mr. Speaker, the United Nations has several charters and conventions which speak to what can and cannot legally be done. And even in times of war, Mr. Speaker, access to food and medicine must never be barred from any nation. This does not apply to the people of Cuba. Mr. Speaker, they have seen their economy kept in a stagnant state for more than 4 decades, and this has caused much suffering. On my own visit to Cuba, Mr. Speaker, I saw a humble set of people. People still willing to fight against all odds, notwithstanding the US embargo. People who still believed in the hope and in their dreams that one day their neighbors across the Caribbean, like Jamaica, their neighbors across the rest of the world will in fact come to their aid and see to the end of this oppressive system of governance that has been waged against them. Mr. Speaker, the time has come. The time has come for the 191 nation states of the United Nations to send a strong signal to any other nation that the strong will of the people must prevail. The strong will of the Cuban people for their own self-determination must prevail. And, Mr. Speaker, notwithstanding the poor relations between Cuba and the United States, and notwithstanding the embargo which prevents Cuba from trading and from having normal relations with the wider world, Cuba continues to boast some of the best social policies in this hemisphere and across the world, and this is most commendable, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the resolution for this House today is one, as I've indicated, of extreme urgency and importance. Mr. Speaker, it is in Jamaica's own interest in terms of doing trade openly with Cuba. It is in Cuba's interest to see its people move also from poverty to prosperity, that we band together and support the resolution that the people of Cuba can truly live freely and fairly. If it so pleases you, Mr. Speaker, I have opened the debate on the motion.
Ms. Hannah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, before I commence my brief remarks, I want to welcome, in true hospitality, I think this one is on.
Ms. Hannah, get to one mic that the Hansard writers can hear you clearly.
Mr. Speaker, I think this one is actually on. May I speak from a seat other than my own, sir?
I'm hearing you, but I'm not sure they
Can you
indicate
hear
they can.
I had commenced to you, sir, that I would like to welcome in true hospitality our new ambassador from Cuba to Jamaica, and also to welcome the representatives from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade that's here, represented by the PS and her staff. Mr. Speaker, as the world seeks to move from confrontation to conciliation, all of us have a responsibility to adopt approaches that respect the right of self-determination and are tolerant of different economic and political systems. It has been over 55 years since the U.S. imposed an embargo on Cuba. The world has changed in profound ways over the course of 55 years. Not only has the embargo failed, but it has imposed severe hardship on the people of Cuba and deprived both the United States and Cuba of valuable trade, investment, tourism, and cultural exchanges. Mr. Speaker, it is incomprehensible that the embargo is still in place. This is the repeatedly expressed view of over 190 countries. The international community has, with few exceptions, resoundingly continued to register their condemnation over the past 20 years and have disregarded the embargo in their economic and diplomatic relations with Cuba. Today, I rise on behalf of the opposition to support the resolution and to say to our friend to the north, the United States of America, that this failed strategy should have been abandoned a long time ago. Mr. Speaker, the dismantling of the embargo would be consistent with U.S. approaches of reconciliation with countries such as Vietnam. We call on the United States to end the embargo and restore normalcy in its relationships with Cuba. We on this side of the House have consistently opposed the embargo and stand ready to work with the government to assist our two closest neighbors in normalization of relations. Let us find a way to remove the outdated, counterproductive, embarrassing, and failed embargo. Mr. Speaker, the United States imposed the embargo on Cuba on February 3, 1962. It involved an embargo on all trade between the United States and Cuba. This action was a continuation of a strategy aimed at regime change in Cuba, which originated at the height of the Cold War. An earlier manifestation of the strategy was the Bay of Pigs invasion, and the danger of this strategy brought the world to the brink of nuclear war in an incident which has become known as a Cuban Missile Crisis. It might be that the United States policy at the time of the bitter Cold War demanded a show of strength in the prevention of the spread of communism in the Caribbean. However, Mr. Speaker, since then the USSR has been dissolved. Communist China sends and lends more money to the United States than any other country in the world, and the Cold War has come to an end. Common coexistence with the ideology of communism is now the United States' daily reality. It is pellucid that Cuba can no longer be regarded as a credible threat to American national security. There is declining political support in the United States for the continuation of the embargo. Mr. Speaker, the Cuban Research Institute, in its 2011 Cuba poll, found that more than 80% of Cuban Americans surveyed said the embargo had not worked very well at all. The wider United States also agrees. A 2012 opinion poll of more than 1,000 U.S. adults found that 62% of respondents thought the United States should reestablish diplomatic relations with Cuba, while only 1 in 4 was against it. Among Americans surveyed, Mr. Speaker, 57% think that the travel ban to Cuba should be lifted, while 27% think the ban should remain. Regarding the trade embargo, Mr. Speaker, 51% of Americans want to open trade with Cuba, compared to 29% who do not. Mr. Speaker, Jamaica has always shown assertive, courageous, and enlightened leadership in our foreign policy and diplomacy. First, when the Right Excellent Norman Manley, even before our independence, led the world when he took the position that Jamaica would not trade with apartheid South Africa. Since then, the policy of the People's National Party administrations have been founded on 1, respect for the sovereignty of nations, 2, respect for the human rights and the citizens of countries, and 3, a non-aligned stance. Mr. Speaker, when it was deemed detrimental to support Cuba after 1962, Michael Manley showed unrelenting support and led a united front with Barbados, Guyana, and Trinidad and Tobago to establish diplomatic relations with Cuba in 1972, being the first in the Western Hemisphere. Mr. Speaker, the government and people of Cuba are well aware of our friendship and strong solidarity. Over the years, Jamaica has demonstrated our support, cooperation, and partnership. Our two countries have shared mutually beneficial bilateral programs, especially in sports, education, and health. However, the embargo has not allowed the full potential of our relationship with Cuba or the United States to flourish. It is time to recognize that the end of the embargo is not just a U.S.-Cuba issue, but one crucial to the national interests of Caribbean countries. The collective economic development, Mr. Speaker, of the Caribbean has been impaired as the embargo inhibits trade, investment, and tourism with a market of friends of 11.5 million people. In 2014, President Barack Obama uttered the Watershed Declaration, and I quote, "It is now time to acknowledge that particular policy has failed," end of quote. With the reestablishment of diplomatic relations and the easement of restrictions on Americans traveling to Cuba in 2014, by President Obama, the Jamaica American Chamber of Commerce recommended that their office be the conduit to facilitate trade with American businesses in Cuba. Jamaica, with its geographical location, is ideally suited as a logistics and coordination port for supplies and business services to Cuba. We are already positioning ourselves for large ships, especially from the Far East and Asia. Cuba will be an important transshipment port, Mr. Speaker, and decisions coming will also have to involve Cuba. The embargo, as embodied in a raft of legislation at the core of which is the Helms-Burton Act, constitutes serious deterrence to both our nations expanding our economies for growth, Mr. Speaker. This act, in particular, enacted in 1996, is only to strengthen the embargo and applies U.S. law extraterritorially to associated parties of U.S. companies. And, for example, Mr. Speaker, many Jamaicans didn't even realize that when the Bank of Nova Scotia in 2006 suspended accounts of Cuban nationals ordinarily resident right here in Jamaica, and when PriceSmart in about 2014 suspended the accounts of Cuban nationals, it is these things and how the embargo has really impacted their lives in different countries. So this is not simply a matter, Mr. Speaker, of sentimental support for our close neighbors and friends in Cuba. This is a matter of urgent concern. It is a matter for Jamaica, and it's time for us to start using our immense influence through our diplomatic channels to remove the embargo. Recently, Mr. Speaker, Cuba has taken some significant steps towards reconciliation that could easily form the basis for new negotiations to succeed. This past Saturday, the Miami Herald reported that the Cuban Foreign Minister, Bruno Rodriguez, announced that an estimated 800,000 people with Cuban passports living abroad will no longer need a qualification stamp in their passports to travel to the island, making it easier for them to visit, Mr. Speaker. Children born abroad of Cuban parents would also be able to apply for Cuban citizenship. Cubans who left the island through illegal means, Mr. Speaker, by raft, for example, will be welcomed back to Cuba for visits. And Cuban Americans will also be allowed to enter and leave from Cuba on recreational boats as long as they travel through certain designated marinas. Mr. Speaker, this is a clear and strong signal from Cuba that their intent is to have respectful negotiations. Mr. Speaker, we have to realize that in the face of the overwhelming statistics supporting the lifting of the embargo, the admission of the failure of the policy at the highest level of the United States, and the unanimous resolution in the United Nations, that there is no movement still at the US Congress level to do the right thing and lift the embargo. The United Nations, Mr. Speaker, is perhaps the most qualified body to provide interlocutory support to help both proud nations secure a pathway for a negotiated settlement to end the embargo. Furthermore, both nations have been long-standing support members of the United Nations. Jamaica will have to do what it has always done best in these situations, Mr. Speaker. Not only remain resolute in the UN to prevent any rollback, but we have to mobilize our CARICOM partners in the struggle and use our enormous influence in the G77 and China to ensure that there is no breach among developing countries. Last year, Mr. Speaker, marked a new stage in the annual process at the United Nations. For the first time, there was not one single vote against the resolution. The representative of the United States, one of two states, abstained, and he said it was time for a new chapter of cooperation. Mr. Speaker, our resolution in this House must carry with it the instruction to our representative not only to vote in favor of the UN resolution, but to be proactive, purposeful, and persistent in our resolve towards ensuring the outcome that we all desire. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Polwell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I too want to join in welcoming the new Cuban ambassador to Jamaica. And even though my Spanish is not as competent as my colleague, I'll just say bienvenido, and I know that we must not use other languages inside here. But welcome, Madam Ambassador. Mr. Speaker, this is the 8th time that we are speaking or addressing this type of resolution in our Parliament, and I have participated on each occasion, and so my comments today will be restricted. But I have to again note, Mr. Speaker, the fact that both sides now speak in one accord in relation to the Cuban issue in Jamaica. And that is so significant as we highlight the end of the Cold War that used to exist in our part of the world. Mr. Speaker, last year when I spoke with some excitement, some hope that with the recently then announced policy by the US administration led by President Obama, that we were truly on the way to seeing to an end of the blockade with the reestablishment of diplomatic relationship between the United States and Cuba. Mr. Speaker, I speak with less hope today and some sadness that we haven't seen the progression as we anticipated would have happened since the reestablishment of the diplomatic relations, and want to make a special appeal to the administration, the new administration, that it would be retrogressive for us to turn back what President Obama started last year. And we urge, rather than looking back, we look forward, knowing that, in the words of President Obama, it has benefited no one. And in fact, the United States stands to benefit economically if the blockade were to be lifted. So we're making a special appeal in that regard. Mr. Speaker, every year we speak of the resourcefulness of the Cuban people the fact that notwithstanding the tremendous economic difficulties they face, that we're seeing a people led by a government that focus on innovation, that have used science and technology, not only for their own benefit, but to also assist worldwide. I remember when I was Minister of Energy, one of the things that we assisted Cuba with, and there are not many areas where we were able to provide them with assistance, but they were, at that time, in 2006, hadn't developed the technology for wind farm, for generation of electricity using wind. And they came to Jamaica, and they observed what we were doing at Wigton Wind Farm. And in 2 years, they not only replicated a wind farm in Cuba, but in fact, in 2 years, they were able to quadruple the capacity that we were able to have in Jamaica. Again, it explains the resourcefulness of the Cuban people. And I'd also mention that in terms of solar technology, they are manufacturers. And in fact, the solar system that I have was actually manufactured in Cuba. So notwithstanding the difficulty they face, they have showed a level of resilience that is truly remarkable. And that resilience extends itself to a tremendous level of generosity, not only in spirit, but in real kind, to their neighbors across the Caribbean, and Jamaica has been a major beneficiary. We have lost Comandante Fidel Castro, and I would like to, as we support this motion, remember the struggles, remember his leadership, and to recognize him as a true freedom fighter, a leader of the revolution that has secured for the Cuban people tremendous benefits. And Fidel will go down as a hero of the 20th century in this world. So, Mr. Speaker, I unreservedly, with tremendous enthusiasm, urge on us to once more, in unanimity, support this motion as we look forward to the day when the blockade will be permanently lifted against the Cuban people. I thank you very much.
Mr. Hilton.
Mr. Speaker, I too would like to add my own voice to what has become an annual motion, well, a resolution in support of the lifting of the blockade against Cuba and the normalization of relations between not only the United States and Cuba, but indeed the entire region. Because, as was said, Mr. Speaker, this debate is not, although the focus has been on Cuba-US relations, or the lack thereof, the fact is, as was said earlier by the opposition speaker, this matter is of concern to us in Jamaica and the Caribbean as much as it is for the Cuban people. Because, after all, Mr. Speaker, as I've said on previous occasions, this is not simply an interruption of the normal diplomatic and economic relations among member states, but it is also a disruption of the normal relation between CARICOM states and Cuba, Jamaica being chief among them. And so, Mr. Speaker, this debate rightfully belongs in this Parliament to bring to the awareness of the Jamaican people that in the imposition of this embargo, the people of Jamaica have suffered as well. They have suffered in the lack of growth and development in their relations with an important member state of CARICOM, of the Caribbean region, and they have suffered in the development of economic ties with Cuba that I think is not only desirable at this point, but I think it's a necessity if we are going to sustain not only our economic, but our development, our general development going forward. And this is particularly important, Mr. Speaker, in light of the onset of climate change and the ravages of hurricane throughout the region. We need to be able to strengthen our relations, not only in economic terms, but in developmental terms with Cuba. And the imposition of the embargo continues to be an obstacle in the way of normal diplomatic, economic arrangements between Cuba and the rest of the Caribbean. And as we come to debate the resolution this year, what is particularly striking is that this debate comes in the midst of the release of the file, the JFK files. These files, Mr. Speaker, makes for interesting reading. Among the findings, among the revelation, if you can call it that, because it has long been noised about, the many attempts that have been made to undermine the Cuban revolution and the attempts at assassination of the Cuban leader. The files now make these beyond peradventure. It's no longer debate about whether those actions had taken place. These are now facts. They are in the files, revealed in the files, about the many acts of sabotage, of near assassination, of attempted assassination on the Cuban leader, and the undermining of the Cuban people and government. Mr. Speaker, in 2017, the reversal of some of the openings to Cuba by the Obama administration, by the current administration, is to be regretted, deeply regretted, because it is again where we had hope, Mr. Speaker, they reverse it in a number of areas. In tourism, no, not going down there. So, Mr. Speaker, where we thought that we are going in a direction of opening up, opening to Cuba, not just for the United States and for the rest of the world, but importantly for the Caribbean, we now see one step backwards. And so those of us who are watching are wondering, how can that be? A policy had been embarked upon by the administration, by the US government. And today we have important reversals in meaningful ways. Mr. Speaker, the answer lies in part to the fact that Cuba, for the United States, is not a foreign policy issue. It is a domestic political issue, an issue for which the voters in certain parts of the United States, given their lineage and their ties to Cuba, have weighed heavily one way or the other in the outcome of their national elections. And therefore we see this flip-flopping on Cuba, depending on the administration in power at the time, rather than a consistent approach, a foreign policy approach to Cuba by the United States of America. So, Mr. Speaker, again, we observe from this part that that relationship, or the lack of development in that relationship, continues to impact on the Caribbean region and on Jamaica in a very adverse way. And as I welcome the Cuban ambassador, the new Cuban ambassador to Jamaica, we will have to say in a statement coming from this Parliament that we stand resolute in support of the Cuban people, of their right to self-determination, and of their right to choose their economic pathways. Mr. Speaker, I want to say finally that I'm a bit disappointed this year, and I hope it is the events of the past few weeks that have taken the focus from an important resolution such as this. Because when we started this motion on this side, some 8 years ago, it was at the highest level that we decided that this motion should be taken in this House, because it still remains the case that Jamaica is one of the few parliaments, one of the few countries in which the parliament debates this issue on an annual basis, and that we should continue to do so until the embargo is lifted is something that I think all of us are in support of. But also, Mr. Speaker, I'm disappointed this year because this is a debate, a resolution that should be moved by the cabinet of this country. Yes, indeed, to show that it's not only the parliament, but the government and parliament is in full support of this resolution. I commend my honourable friend from St. Catherine, East Central. But the point is, Mr. Speaker, that this really needs to support the imprimatur of the Cabinet of Jamaica to send the signal to the rest of the world that we in Jamaica take this matter at the highest level and very seriously, because it is a matter that have implication for our own long-term growth and development, and the importance of it, I think, is somewhat diminished. I hope that next year we'll get back on track, where either the administration through its cabinet moves the resolution, or this side will continue to move the resolution as we have done from the very beginning. Because the bipartisan support is important, but I think more importantly, it is the signal that is sent to the rest of the world that Jamaica at the highest level, both through its parliament and its government, is in full support, fulsome support of the lifting of the embargo and the continued support of the people of Cuba. Mr. Speaker, I believe the debate to be both a rich debate, one that is, I believe, should be continued, and I want to associate myself again this year with the moving of the resolution and my support for this resolution. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Terilyn.
Mr. Speaker, I now ask that the motion be approved.
Those in favor? Aye. Those against? The ayes have it. Motion approved.
Mr. Speaker, I'm asking for statement by Minister to be committed, and no's a motion given orally for the Prime Minister to make a statement and to move a resolution, a motion.
You're recommending.
I'm requesting the recommittal of statement by Minister to give the Prime Minister an opportunity to make a statement, and also recommend a notice of motions given orally for the Prime Minister to bring forward the motion.
Those in favor? Aye. Those against? The ayes have it.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, members. Mr. Speaker, as I stand here today, it is of grave concern to all Jamaicans, regardless of political persuasion, that our murder rate is rising and now stands at approximately 300 murders above the figure for the corresponding period last year. Mr. Speaker, the driving factors are well known. Gang warfare, compounded by extortion, lottery scamming, drugs, and contract killings account for over 70% of murders committed, with some estimates as high as 80% of murders. However, Mr. Speaker, there is still a high level of murders driven by non-organized criminal activity. In other words, by the inability of our citizens to resolve conflicts peacefully. All of this is further compounded by a national crisis that has reached epidemic proportions. The prevalence and ease of access to guns and ammunition. The government considers this to be a national emergency and will we will expand, Mr. Speaker, on strategies to deal with these issues at a later date. Already, some of the strategies we are employing are yielding greater results. We have recovered 726 firearms, including 62 rifles to date, as compared to 515 firearms, including 32 rifles at this time in 2016. In terms of ammunition, for the corresponding period, the figures show an increase of almost threefold of that of the related period last year, moving to 20,491 rounds compared to just 7,341 rounds last year for the same period. While recovery of firearms and ammunition has increased, we need to enforce greater control measures to ensure that we curb the flow of guns and ammunition into the country. Just as an aside, Mr. Speaker, the increased recovery of firearms could not be exclusively attributed to just greater policing, greater intelligence gathering. I believe we must acknowledge as a country, Mr. Speaker, that there has also been an increase in the propensity to bring in illegal weapons into the country. And so, Mr. Speaker, though we take credit for increasing our fines and greater use of intelligence, this should not be totally comforting, because I still hold the view that there are those among us who make it their reason for existence to bring in illegal weapons. And many of them, Mr. Speaker, have made a profitable business out of it. And we, Mr. Speaker, must redouble our efforts to get those persons who are bringing in illegal firearms and ammunition into the country. Mr. Speaker, the scourge of crime cannot be tackled with quick fixes. We must get to the root problems. The strategies must establish stability and long-lasting transformational results. Mr. Speaker, the zones of special operations is a whole-of-government response to crime in a strategic, coordinated, and sustainable manner. The ultimate mandate of the zone of special operations is to secure the right to life of all citizens. Mr. Speaker, today I'll give an overview of activities within Mount Salem and Denham Town and the next steps for both the zones. Mr. Speaker, the declaration of the Mount Salem Zone of Special Operations as the first zone of special operations on September the 1st, 2017, was a landmark event in the history of Jamaica. The experience has produced innumerable lessons at various levels: operational, tactical, and strategic. Some lessons have been specific to the way our security forces operate, while others have been much broader and have guided policy decisions and revisions. Cumulatively, all lessons have added value through increased awareness and knowledge, and continue to inform best practices in crime fighting and community building. Mr. Speaker, during the 60 days, the first 60 days of the security interventions in Mount Salem, the members of the Joint Force have been focused, diligent, and thorough, and have largely reflected the exemplary professional ethos that is expected from all service members in the security force. During the clear phase of the operation, the Joint Force used its special powers to saturate the area, removing the influence of gangs and disrupting criminal activity wherever it existed. During the whole phase, the force was tasked to focus on creating an environment in which the state's presence could be effectively re-established, thereby reducing the opportunity and capacity of criminals to commit crime. In furtherance of their duties, the Joint Force executed a number of operations which had varied results. Through some of these operations, and augmented by the repackaged and relaunched Get the Guns rewards program, we have recovered several illegal weapons. It is also worthwhile to note that over the period, there were no reported incidents between the citizens and the Joint Forces. There was no incident of shooting, murder, or any serious crime in the zone. And the citizens of the community have been able to replace fear and disquiet with safety and reassurance because of the deliberate action of the state. Mr. Speaker, to the extent that the preservation of life and the restoration of the community's confidence in legitimate state structures were highlighted as being of utmost importance, the Mount Salem zone should be considered as a successful endeavor. It is anticipated then that the reassurance provided by the state must continue to be matched by responsible citizenry. Mr. Speaker, already there has been noted progress in the willingness of citizens to partner with the state to remove the presence of violence producers, wanted persons, illegal firearm, and even, Mr. Speaker, illegal immigrants from the communities. And just to pause there, Mr. Speaker, the security operations are not just focused on guns and ammunition or dealing with violence producers, but we have discovered several pieces of equipment, pieces of technological devices used in lottery scamming. We have discovered several pieces of equipment used in credit card fraud, banking fraud, and yes, Mr. Speaker, we have discovered illegal immigrants in some of these communities, specifically persons with Haitian nationality that are here illegally. So the security operations are broad, and they are having an impact not just on murders, but right across the spectrum. Additionally, citizens have understood the necessity of the overwhelming security presence and the countless special operations and checkpoints that have affected their routines. In fact, I must specially commend the citizens of Mount Salem who have been the real engine behind the progress within the zone. They have been supportive of the initiative and they have displayed outstanding interest and ownership of their community. Where they have been dissatisfied, they have made their issues known, and where they have been discontented, frustrated, or concerned, these articulations have been promptly addressed through consensus and partnership. It is for this reason that the progress in Mount Salem must be continued in earnest. In 60 days, much has been achieved, but much more is still left to be done. With the efforts thus far largely focused on clearing and holding the space, an additional 60 days is now necessary to give focus to the build phase. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, in accordance with Section 5 of the Act, the Prime Minister and Council, after consultation with the Joint Command, may, by order, subject to affirmative resolution of the House of Representatives, extend the period referred to in Section 4.3 for such further periods. Mr. Speaker, during the course of the sitting, we will recommit the item notices of motion, and I will, at announcements rather, and we will make the announcement of the resolution, and then during public business, we will seek to have the consensus of the House in extending the zone for a further 60 days in Mount Salem. Just as an aside, Mr. Speaker, the bill that we brought to Parliament contemplated that the National Security Council could authorize the extension, and we were asking that the extension could be done twice over, and then after that come to Parliament. The wisdom of the Senate reviewed the bill that we brought, and we agreed to compromise on that point, and therefore I'm standing here at 60 days of the Mount Salem Zone of Special Operation, requesting the Parliament to give its approval for the extension of the zone. And I raise the point, Mr. Speaker, it's a point that has to be made, that as lawmakers, we do not necessarily, at the point of making the legislation, have full knowledge of what is the intention of the bill being proposed. And there was great fear that what was being proposed was a draconian act, something that would deprive people of their rights. And no matter what assurances were given, it operated in particularly on the minds of opposition members that it was a draconian measure. In seeking to build consensus, we at that point said it is important, it is of greater importance that the bill be passed with consensus rather than be forced through by a majority. And so we conceded on the point. But it has advantages and disadvantages. It forces me to bring regular updates to the Parliament. But it does poses an administrative challenge in terms of just the time and resources consumed in ensuring that the zone is compliant with the very onerous requirements of the law. I'm saying it to say, Mr. Speaker, that there are aspects of the Zone of Special Operations Law Reform Act that we may have to take a second look at some future point, and I want to put the House on notice. Having seen the strategy in operation, I believe that there are things that we can do as a Parliament to actually improve the operation of the legislation. So during this period, Mr. Speaker, during this debate, I will move the resolution, and I hope to have the consensus of the House in the extension of the zone for a further 60 days. Having said that as well, I'm certain that it would be a reasonable assumption that no member inside here would believe that we would be able to transform a community in a sustainable and long-lasting way in 60 days. That we have managed to do what we have done is commendable, but the kind of long-term transformation that we are seeking cannot be done in 60 days. And indeed, when the policy was contemplated, we did not contemplate 60 days as the point where we could end and withdraw. This is, as I've always maintained, a long-term intervention to bring about a long-lasting peace that the community can own and manage. In fact, Mr. Speaker, the social intervention committees have just now completed their first phase, which is to sit with the community, get them involved. It's a whole lot of consultation. And those members of parliament who have been involved in these kinds of things would realize that you can't get community consensus in just 60 days. It is a time-consuming, intricate, detailed kind of operation. So, in a sense, Mr. Speaker, it is good that I'm here reporting, but it also doesn't fit well with the general policy. But it is the law, and we follow the law, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Social Intervention Committee, during the whole phase, which we are now in the whole phase of operations in Mount Salem, they will be given great space to continue their work, and we expect that during this phase that they will be able to actually start significant interventions. So we are expecting to see within this phase that the Social Intervention Committee will actually start to have tangible interventions in the zone of special operations. Moving now towards the build phase, which is next to come. Mr. Speaker, so far, the social intervention framework applied to Mount Salem has utilized an integrated approach, which is built on two pillars. The first is crime prevention through environmental design, which focuses on urban upgrading to the physical and environmental space to reduce opportunities for crime. And the second pillar is crime prevention through social development, which focuses on addressing the underlying human and social risk factors of crime and violence. Mr. Speaker, to this end, the Social Intervention Committee has undertaken a number of activities. You will recall in my first report at 14 days that we hosted in Mount Salem a community fair. During that period of time, we brought in critical social services, particularly for identification. And I think we can now say, Mr. Speaker, that that population would now be adequately served in terms of the social agencies that would help the citizens to gain some form of national ID. We, the Social Intervention Committee, has been hosting a series of community workshops with the community leaders. And this is critical for identifying community leadership. Because, Mr. Speaker, when the security forces eventually leave the space, that space has to be managed by community leaders. And it is important that it is not informal leadership of dons, but people who are in the formal system, people who are law-abiding citizens who will take up a leadership role in their communities. And so we are identifying them from now, empowering them. You know, Mr. Speaker, just as an aside, we have always contemplated that there will be leaders in every community, and that the cascading of the state would come down to every community. So yes, you would have the policeman, who is a formal representative of the state, but then you'd also have the concept of the district constable, who, yes, is a formal representative of the state, but more so a representative of the community. And then you would have the justice of the peace, yes, a formal representative of the state, but even more so, someone who is in the community to ensure peace. So, Mr. Speaker, we're not doing anything new, but what we are trying to do is to ensure that the state cascades down to the community, and that there is formal representation there, that we are training them, we are putting them in place. These people that we identify as leaders, some of them will eventually become JPs. Who knows? Maybe the police will see it fit to appoint some of them as district constables. But it is a formal process of re-establishing the state in the community. The JCF, Mr. Speaker, has developed the community safety plan, and we have been hearing quite a bit about that in the news. And in fact, the plan involves curfews for children, adding the Mount Salem Primary and Junior High to the Safe Schools program, and police school resource officers will be assigned to the school, and a mentorship program has also been established for youngsters in the Mount Salem community. Another important initiative has been the launch of a community cleanup project. When we toured the zone, Mr. Speaker, what was immediately clear to us was that the area needed to be cleaned. It was immediate, and I'm certain that the member from Manchester Central, when he toured, would have also seen that that was an immediate need. And so that was addressed, Mr. Speaker. The NSWMA and the NWA have partnered to do a community cleanup, and this is going on now for the past 2 weeks. Mr. Speaker, during the cleanup, some 60 persons were engaged for employment. And 25 persons have been engaged now permanently as environmental wardens with responsibility to maintain the state of cleanliness within the community and to coordinate the agency response for environmental issues. And just to say, Mr. Speaker, that the environmental wardens are not just there to report garbage pile up and to help to train people in the community about waste disposal, but they also will be looking at, for example, issues to do with vectors, disease-carrying vectors, to report to the Ministry of Health about water gathering that breeds mosquitoes or where rats may be. So they are doing a wide range of things to ensure sanitation and cleanliness within the zone. Mr. Speaker, we have reserved some resources within the NWA to start to treat with drains and gullies and to repair roads in those areas. Those have been identified. The NWC is active in the area regularizing water connections, and the JPS is also in the area, Mr. Speaker, regularizing electricity connections. So far, Mr. Speaker, we have had just over 50 persons registered under the HOPE initiative, where they are now being trained, and we have secured over 20 persons in terms of permanent employment within the zone. In the next 60 days, if the House so approves, the Social Intervention Committee will divide its work into 7 working groups. So there will be a working group to deal with the physical environment. And that is where issues to do with road repairs, cleaning up the gullies, maintaining the drains, and repairing drains that are damaged, they will oversee that. Then there is land tenure. Mr. Speaker, the land agency has been in the area. They have conducted some surveys, and they are looking at how we can regularize the titling process there and give people ownership of the land that they are now occupying. Then there is a community safety working group, and they will be working with the youngsters in particular to set up the youth clubs and the other leadership engagement and training that has to go on, particularly in parenting, Mr. Speaker. One of the things that has been reported is that there is great need in these communities for training the parents, because there is, I mean, I want to tread carefully on that, but there's almost a breakdown in just good parenting in these communities. And so then, Mr. Speaker, there is a Human and Community Development and Employment Working Group, and they will be working closely with the HOPE program to identify the youngsters, to get them in a program of training, and then to help them transition into full employment. Business and Economic Development Working Groups. In these communities, Mr. Speaker, there are businesses, and I see great potential in those communities for even more business development, and they will be tasked to see how we can expand businesses in the Mount Salem. Mr. Speaker, when we talk about community development, nation building, we tend to leave out or not pay attention to the spiritual aspect of man. And we tend to look at development as unidimensional. And I'm sure the reverend gentleman from Central Kingston will agree with me that when we talk about development, you must include the spiritual development of the person. Foundation. And so there's a working group that is tasked to work with faith-based organizations within the area and surrounding the area to make sure that we have a comprehensive development plan. Mr. Speaker, I think that in 60 days we have accomplished a lot, but there is still a lot more to be done. I think we have shown that we can deploy our security forces without abusing our people. We have shown that our people actually welcome the security presence and want to see more. It is the starting point, it is the main ingredient of the rebuilding of trust in our system. And if we continue along this point, if the community continues to receive the security forces well and the security forces continue to act professionally, the flow of information that is necessary to combat crime. Because right now, just talking from a strategic standpoint, crime fighting cannot be as focused as it should be because we don't have the sharpening tool of information and intelligence. So in the absence of information and intelligence where you can do targeted operations, you have to do operations such as the zone to create the space where citizens can function like citizens. Citizens can say, I don't like what is happening in my community, and I am going to share the information with the police. Because the police respects me, will keep the information that I give confidential and act in a responsible way with it. And so that's the part of the foundation of the zone. As it works well, Mr. Speaker, you will see greater intelligence flow. And at this point, I don't want to say too much. But anyone listening to the news as it relates to crime and the activities of the police and the recovery of weapons you would see that there is much greater activity and success of the police in fighting crime and in the recovery of weapons. And not just weapons, but dealing with lottery scamming and all kinds of other things. That part of that is as a result of information that is being gathered within the zone, in proximity to the zone, as a result of the zones. We have incentivized this information sharing by providing a $100 million fund, which is resourcing the Get the Guns campaign and Crime Stop. Any citizen at all, anywhere in Jamaica, and I'm particularly now appealing to those who are in the zones now, but any citizen anywhere in Jamaica, if you know something that could lead to the arrest or the recovery, call Crime Stop or give information to a trusted police officer. You will be rewarded for valid information. It's 150,000. You know where a couple are? Just call Crime Stop. call 311. If you know where any are, call 311. He'll reward you right away. But we have seen some results, Mr. Speaker, but I must confess that I'm a little bit disappointed that it hasn't been taken up as much. Part of the reason is that the publicity, we haven't publicized it as much. So I'm using this platform to make the appeal. You know, we have made some very large discoveries over the past 2 months. Not all of them are linked to this program, but some of them are, and I won't say which are for obvious reasons. But it works. If you are in your community and you see a man walking past a yard every day with M16, one day, quietly, in your bedroom, or go out somewhere and just tell Crime Stop, you would have done far more in bringing peace to your community than you can imagine. I appeal to all Jamaicans, play your part. So, Mr. Speaker, I will be asking the House to extend the zone of special operations for a further 60 days. We will go through the parliamentary procedure. Mr. Speaker, the law also requires that after 14 days of the implementation of a zone, that I make a report to Parliament. So, Mr. Speaker, we are at that point where I have to make a report on the Denham Town Zone of Special Operation. The declaration of the Denham Town community as the second zone of special operations on the 17th of October 2017 signaled another move by the government to address the issue of crime in our society. The Denham Town community is the birthplace of some of Jamaica's greatest success stories and cultural icons, and continues to be the home of some of Jamaica's most promising prospects. Generations in Denham Town have, however, been victimized by the unacceptable level of violence that has stifled opportunities and curtailed liberties. Most unfortunate is the fact that this population of more than 8,000 residents is being exposed to such intolerable degrees of risk by a handful of deviants who have sought to traumatize their fellow citizens through rampant criminality. Mr. Speaker, if we allow violence to become regularized, then the state of fear becomes normalized, and this will never be accepted as the reality of Jamaica's current and future generations. The 17 murders in Denham Town in 2017, then, are 17 murders too many, and constitute an environment which requires special focus. The ongoing gang warfare, rampant criminality, escalating violence and murder, and the threat to the rule of law in Denham Town are rejected by the government and must be rejected by the residents themselves. While the declaration of the community as a zone of special operations is not expected to be a miracle fix, if the experience of Mount Salem should serve as an example of what can be achieved through this strategy in the preservation of life, then, Mr. Speaker, the outlook for Denham Town is not only favorable, but promising for the entire West Kingston. It is critical to reiterate that citizen support and partnership with the state must be paramount. Now, more than ever, members of the community must seize the opportunity to shed negative stigmatization and counter any perception that they condone or support the very criminal elements that seek to destroy their community. The state has reaffirmed its commitment to ensuring public safety and security and will restore the trust and confidence that has been eroded. This must be matched by an eagerness of the community to likewise build the partnership through positive interactions and an exercise of patience and understanding during the process designed to achieve renewal. Mr. Speaker, the first 10 days of the joint force regarding activities in the Denham Town community has been promising. While there were expectedly varying views regarding the declaration, the overwhelming response from residents of the community has been positive. In addition to welcoming the initiative, many residents have further expressed relief as they are now able to move freely within their community and pursue their livelihoods free from fear. Mr. Speaker, when I read this, I reflect that there are some Jamaicans who may take this point for granted. They are able to go home, they can live in peace, they don't hear gunshots in their community. But there are many Jamaicans who live in communities that are captured. I mean, can you imagine living in a community where you could wake up one day and hear that 5 houses belonging to your neighbors have been burnt down? Or a Don man comes and says, I like your daughter, send her to me. Or you have your shop and you open on a Friday, and when you're doing your pay bill, you have to add on 3 or 4 more persons who never turn up to work, but you are paying them to protect you from them. And this is the reality of many Jamaicans. So I'm not surprised, Mr. Speaker, that the communities that we choose, that the people welcome the security forces and want them to stay. Because the fear has never been that they don't want the security forces. The fear is that the strategy to fight crime has been to just come in and SWAT. The problem with that strategy is that you may hit the pest, but you could also hit an innocent person. And that has been the real challenge with security operations. Now we have taken a different approach where we make it top-heavy in accountability. We take away the risk from the security forces because they are there in mass. They can control the environment, they can gather information, and they can target their operations. They can separate the law-abiding citizens from the criminals. That is how we should be policing even without the zones. But that is going to take some time to bring the security forces along, to bring the residents along. So, I believe the opposition is there. So, you're not going to have this transformation in how we carry out security operations overnight. And sometimes we need what is called, Mr. Speaker, a demonstration effect. And so what the zones are doing is to give a demonstration of how you can effectively and properly police an area. Now, granted, Mr. Speaker, it is a resource-intense kind of operation. It is resource-intense, however, in the first 2 phases. After that, it will trend downwards, and we expect that the community now will rise up in its own leadership, take over its piece, and manage it. Some people might say this is wishful thinking, but I want those who hold that view to look at where it has been successful. If you consider the Grant Spend community 15 years ago, you probably wouldn't think that Grant Spend, that community, could be as peaceful, knock on wood, as it continues to be for that period of time. There was an intervention, a very serious security intervention, which removed a criminal element from the space. But then there was also significant social intervention, which left long-lasting legacies there, and the community continues to thrive and build around it. It took Grant Spend, I would say, a decade to recover to the point where businesses have now started to move back into the area to make investments. So it can work. The other community that I would want to point out is Augustown, a different kind of intervention, a longer-term social intervention. And we have to commend the various social interventions that have happened through the PMI, through the citizens groups that have been there, the donors community that play significant resources there, and various initiatives that were put on by the government that intervened in that community. Today it is holding the peace, knock on wood that it will continue, but you have to have a framework. It can't be just haphazard. You have to have a framework in which you are going to strategically do these kinds of intervention and support them over the long term. And that is what the zone of special operation is designed to do. Mr. Speaker, since the declaration of the Denhamtown zone, there has been no incident of murder or shooting in the zone, and residents are being encouraged to continue to play their part in making the community violence-free. Mr. Speaker, within the first 10 days of the Denhamtown zone, which is bigger in area than the Mount Salem zone, the forces have spent those first days establishing the zone, and that's very important in terms of building out a forward operating base, having the checkpoints in place, and doing the operations necessary to control the domain. Mr. Speaker, since that time, they have done over 40,000 searches. So that means if you were to look at the number of checkpoints that they have had and the people passing through the checkpoints, 40,000. And that's very significant and important in controlling the space. Mr. Speaker, so far, they have recovered a shotgun, ammunition, several other weapon paraphernalia, and importantly, which I found to be very important, a credit card skimming machine. And people underestimate a credit card skimming machine. Skimming. So what this machine does, well, it's part of the whole, but what the machine does is to lift. It reads the card and lifts off the data off the card. So if your card is stolen, they can use this machine, lift it, place it on another card, or use the information on the card to access your account. Mr. Speaker, 7 known violent producers have been arrested in the zone. Now, you cannot underestimate the importance of that. 7 known violence producers have been arrested in the zone. And that's within 14 days of operations. The joint force, Mr. Speaker, within the first 10 days, took a different tact than what was taken in the Mount Salem zone. So the joint forces engaged in significant community building, community relations building exercises. So they participated in public sanitation efforts, in various meetings with the justices of the peace, meeting with leadership of various community groups in the area. So they did quite a bit of community sensitization. So quite a bit of their efforts within the first 14 days were focused on community sensitization. This is a matter of lesson learned from the first zone, where we had several issues happening, where statements were made, people didn't understand. And so what we have done this time around is to make sure that there are no inflammatory statements and that all the stakeholders are properly briefed, that we go and meet with them as stakeholders, and so that they understand. And that is what the first 14 days effort, most of it was consumed in doing that. Again, learning experience, we do it better the second time around, and we'll do it better the third and fourth and how many ever time around. Mr. Speaker, we have put in place a social intervention committee. I'm not going to go too much into that. I think the point is made. And we have gazetted the social intervention committee. But Denham Town is not a community that is not, the best way to express it, Mr. Speaker, is that Denham Town has had several attempts at community interventions. And the fact is, Mr. Speaker, that there are already ongoing projects of social intervention in Denham Town. So the role of the social intervention committee in Denham Town might be slightly different from that in Mount Salem, where Mount Salem you have to start from scratch. Here, JSIF is already coordinating several social intervention programs. So, Mr. Speaker, I'll just name a few. There's a major road rehabilitation project, which will see areas such as Albert Street, Elgin Street, Milk Lane, Nelson Street, Bread Lane, Chestnut Lane, all of those, the Member of Parliament would be quite aware. There is a water supply project which aims to improve water supply, potable water supply to the community, and not just, and just to be clear, not just to the zone, but to all the communities in the West Kingston area. There's a sewage project which will benefit the Denham Town community. It will benefit Tivoli Gardens. It will also benefit, it will benefit Hannahtown as well. I believe it has already started in Hannahtown. And there are several other projects that are already on stream. So what this zone will do is to create the space in which these projects can be more effectively managed and implemented. Mr. Speaker, I want to close my presentation by saying that there are about 20 communities in Jamaica which the National Security Council could just close its eyes and just select one, because all of them, by the criteria in the law, qualifies as a zone. So I do hear the cry of people saying, I want a zone in my community. I hear the people of Flanker. I hear all the communities saying you want a zone, you want a zone. I hear. And we are putting in place the resources. We are developing the knowledge of how to do this and do it more efficiently. So my answer to people who are saying, I need a zone here, I need a zone here, is that yes, as long as your community remains in the top 20 communities by virtue of violence, escalating murders, gang warfare, and a threat to rule of law, the government is obliged by the law to make an intervention as the resources see fit. So we are committed to taking back Jamaica one community at a time. It's not going to be an overnight thing. It's not going to be snap of a finger and flip of a switch. But it is a sustained, strategic, coordinated, well-planned approach that when we have done this, we can leave for the coming generation a more peaceful and prosperous Jamaica. I therefore urge the Parliament to accept the report of the 14-day operation in Denham Town and to extend the Mount Salem zone of operations for a further 60 days. May it please you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, any and every initiative by the government that serves to reduce crime and violence in Jamaica and the threat to life is welcomed by the opposition. And I'll say at the outset, Mr. Speaker, we have no objection to the extension being sought by the government in this matter. I wish to just make a few observations and comment. I think it's pretty much a consensus by all Jamaicans as to the contributing factors inside the community, infrastructure deficiencies, etc. And therefore, any intervention that can deal with these can contribute towards the medium to long-term reduction or propensity for crime and violence. Prime Minister, there is one element that you made mention of that I want to suggest that a bit more emphasis be placed on. You spoke about getting the community groups as part of the crime maintaining social intervention, but dispute resolution within the community, I think, should be central in that social intervention trust. But to ramp it up as a sense of urgency, develop a capacity of people to resolve their disputes by themselves in an orderly way. And Prime Minister, in addition to those things that you made mention of, is to build on the whole question of public order generally in those communities. And all island, and I'm coming to that in a moment. Because while we welcome these positive developments in the Zozo, the fact of the matter is that there are a number of other communities that are urgent, and you will agree, that urgently need this to happen there, right? The question then is the capacity to replicate these. We have a second one now, but the capacity to replicate them in the many different areas where there's urgent need, given the fact that even with the Mount Salem Zozo and then the second one in Denham Town, we still have the increase in numbers that you made reference to at the beginning. So there is, in fact, while this is welcome there is still the urgent need to halt this wrong directional movement of the murder rates throughout the country. Even in St. James itself, where you have one Zozo, adjacent to Mount Salem, in the parish, you end up to just under 60 more murders throughout the period, which sends a very, not only consistent, but it's very frightening, because if you have the security forces amassed in the way that they are in Zozo, and criminals can feel at ease to carry out these murders and around the area, it doesn't cause us much comfort, not denying the benefits in the Zozo area. And so what we really want is simultaneous with what is happening in the zones is some other initiative to arrest or at least all the escalation in other areas. Prime Minister, I am pleased that you, in your opening remark, you acknowledge that it has become an epidemic. It is. This is not a problem that is looming before us, it's one that we have now. And therefore, urgent and comprehensive intervention is of the moment. So I'm very, very pleased that recognition has been made. And the other point, Prime Minister, sadly so, in those communities, to Zozo areas and many other areas in Jamaica, violence has become regularized, to the point that many members of the communities become numb to murders around them. And I've listened to some of the commentators who work in these communities. Just recently, well down Montego Bay, and spoke with some of the community people who are involved in mediation exercises. People just take murder as just another event. That is a frightening reality. So it is not becoming Prime Minister, it's already here. What is sought to be achieved from Zozo and all else is to reverse that. Again, it underscores the urgency of what is before us. You made mention, Prime Minister, and my friend from West Kingston was teased about what is not going to go to them. There has been a long concern by many Jamaicans that you only get attention when you give trouble. So the Zozo areas will get the kind of infrastructural attention that it really needs. But then again, you have many communities where there are less killing, less murders committed, in dire need of some of these infrastructure. I want to suggest, Prime Minister, that in the assessment, what is to be done, because we don't want to be catching up all the time. We want to prevent. So yes, we are catching up in one area, but simultaneously, we are preventing. So in the surveys, social surveys which are done, to identify some of those potential areas for the kind of murders, even some that are already on track already, and seek to implement some of these, both social and infrastructural intervention, so that we are preventing while we are trying to cure problem on the other hand. I believe, Prime Minister, that must be attended to with some sense of urgency, because we are already behind. It's a large, big catch-up exercise that we're on now. Prime Minister, the opposition have said it, I repeat it here today. The challenge of dealing with crime and violence in Jamaica requires a collective assault. You can't do it alone as a government. We can't do it alone as opposition. It must be a collective effort. And it's for that reason we stand ready to cooperate with the government in all ways possible to deal with the issue of crime and violence throughout the many communities in Jamaica, because all of us, in here and out of here, are at risk. To all stratas of society are at risk. So it must, no option about it, it must be a collective effort. And again, whatever we can do on our part to do it. In terms of legislation, in terms of mobilizing public support, we are there towards that end to make Jamaica a safer place.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the member for the well-considered positions that he has put in his statement. I'll respond to two. One is the increase in in murders, because that's the only one that has basically increased. All others, shootings and murders, but you would call, a shooting a failed murder. It's still, yeah. So it's very frightening. But so one of the things that we are cognizant of with the zones, and I have to be careful, the Minister of National Security and myself always discuss this, the National Security Advisor, that we can't say too much of what we are doing in the House. But I want to reassure you that we too have the same concern. Displacement will have an impact. And so there has to be a parallel strategy of dealing with displacement. I want to assure you that there is such a strategy in place. Again, I can't say too much about that. And I want to say that we will take up your suggestion about looking at other communities and creating another program where people who play by the rules, people who keep the law, people who are law-abiding, that they get rewarded. And that's very important. And so I want to reassure you, member, that I will, at a later stage, come back to the House with at least to share my thinking to see how this could be done as a program. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I ask for recommittal of announcements.
Those in favor? Aye. Those against? As of it. Announcements.
Also laid on the table of the House today is the law reform, zones of special operations, special security and community development measures, the Mount Salem community and environs in the parish of St. James Zone, extension of period of operation order 2017 under the law reforms, zones of special operations, special security and community development measures act 2017.
Finish. Mr. Speaker, I ask for recommittal of notice of motion given orally.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg to give notice that at the next meeting of the House, I will move the law reform zones of special operations, special security, community development measures, Mount Salem community and environs in the parish of St. James Zone, extension of period of operation order, Resolution 2017 under the law reform zones of special operations, special security and community development measures Act 2017. Whereas Section 4 of the law reform zones of special operations, special security and community development measures Act 2017, hereinafter referred to as the Act, provides that the Prime Minister in Council may, by order, declare a geographically defined area within a single continuous boundary in Jamaica as a zone of special operations for a period not exceeding 60 days if there are reasonable grounds to believe that due to rampant criminality, gang warfare, escalating violence, and murder, and the threat to the rule of law and public order, it is necessary so to do. And whereas, in accordance with that section, the Prime Minister in Council made the law reform, zones of special operations, special security and community development measures, the Mount Salem community and environs in the parish of St. James Zone, Order 2017, and whereas that order provides that the said zone shall operate for a period of 60 days, and whereas Section 5 of the Act provides that the Prime Minister in Council, after consultation with the Joint Command, may, by order, subject to affirmative resolution of the House of Representatives, extend the said period, and whereas on the 31st day of October 2017, the Prime Minister in Council made the law reform, zones of special operations, special security and community development measures, the Mount Salem community and environs in the parish of St. James Zone, extension of period operation, Order 2017. Now therefore be it resolved by this Honourable House as follows. 1. This resolution may be cited as a law reform, zones of special operations, special security and community development measures, the Mount Salem community and environs in the parish of St. James Zone, extension of period of operation, Order, Resolution 2017, and 2, the law reform, zones of special operations, special security and community development measures, the Mount Salem community and environs in the parish of St. James Zone, extension of period of operation, Order 2017, which was laid on the table of the House on the 31st day of October, is hereby affirmed.
Public business.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to give notice that at the next sitting of the House, I'll move the suspension, yes.
Mr. Speaker, I move for suspension of the standing order to allow the Prime Minister to take the motion which he gave earlier.
Those in favor? Those against? As have it. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I now move for the suspension of the standing orders to enable me to take the motion, notice of which I gave earlier.
Those in favor? Those against? As have it. Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We would have discussed almost all the pertinent issues relating to the resolution. I know that there are members on this side who would want to further elucidate the position. All I would ask is that we do this in a consensus way, so that the criminal element does not in any way feel that there is a separation at the level of the political directorate of the country.
Mr. Speaker, may I have your permission to speak from a seat other than my own? May it so please you, Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of this resolution. Mr. Speaker, as the Member of Parliament for the constituency of St. James West Central, in which the Mount Salem zone is operating, I wholeheartedly support the extension of the operations of the zone. Mr. Speaker, my support is a reflection of what the people of the Mount Salem division have asked me to report to this House. They have also asked me to recall, for the record, on their behalf, the concerns as to what the zone would bring and to say that having experienced it, they could only hope that the operations continue for all times. We are, however, mindful of the resource constraints, Mr. Speaker, and it is my hope that the residents will continue to cooperate as they have been cooperating with the security forces. I have taken the deliberate decision, Mr. Speaker, to allow room for the agents of the state to work without anyone fearing undue political influence. And I did so in the context of many concerns being raised. Even before we had an opportunity to try and execute and implement the law, concerns were being raised. And I'm very pleased, Mr. Speaker, that no one can truthfully say, insofar as the operations, that there has been any undue political influence in any way. Mr. Speaker, I'm also pleased that the concerns of the critics and the skeptics about potential abuse have not been materialized. And one need only look at the reports of interviews with the residents within the zone and to just see their feedback. They have expressed concerns, and along the way, those concerns were noted and addressed by the National Security Council. And in that regard, Mr. Speaker, I want to say how grateful I am as a member of the Social Intervention Committee for the zone and also as a member of the National Security Council for the time taken by residents in the zone, by residents in the wider St. James community, and by the skeptics from afar who have observed and have given constructive feedback. We have listened, Mr. Speaker, and I believe I have to highlight this point and just emphasize that we have a tendency to get into panic mode, Mr. Speaker, when we hear of actions to be taken by the state to deal with the rampant criminality, the escalating violence, the threats to public order and the rule of law. And I understand those concerns, Mr. Speaker, because in truth, our law books are replete with examples of where we have gotten it wrong. But what can be said today, Mr. Speaker, that insofar as this law reform, Zones of Special Operations, Special Security and Community Development Measures Act 2017 is concerned, that the worst fears have not been materialized. I say to the wider public who may be listening, Mr. Speaker, that they have to continue to trust the machinery of government in spite of the need to continue to rebuild the trust. We understand that it has been broken many times, but the alternative, Mr. Speaker, is really no alternative at all. And so I'm also very pleased to hear of the support of the opposition for the extension of the operations of the zone, Mr. Speaker. It is a good thing, and the support is commended. On behalf of the residents of the zone in my constituency, Mr. Speaker, the constituency that I have the privilege of standing in this House to represent the people, I wholeheartedly support this extension. May it so please you.
Minister Montague.
Mr. Speaker, I too stand to support the extension because the work that is being done in the zones is commendable, and I would want to take this opportunity to commend members of the security forces for the excellent job that they are doing in both zones, and in particular, but across Jamaica. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, we have seen an improvement in the relationships between the police, the army, and the wider society. And I would wish to commend the deliberate effort on the part of the leadership of our security forces in engaging members of the public in a new relationship, in a new way. And the work in the zones underlines this new thrust. Indeed, sir, yesterday in the 3 by-elections, the work of the police and the army, it was commendable in terms of, in most cases, their high level of professionalism. There were, of course, 1 or 2 incidents, especially the traffic jam in Honourable, but that was a result of some persons trying to leave the town very quickly. And too much of them leaving at the same time. So, hurriedly. So we as a matter of fact, Mr. Speaker, let me also pause to congratulate the 3 contestants in the democratic exercise, the successful person, and those that were not successful, because they too assisted in the democratic process. I know, sir, the argument is indeed done. Mr. Speaker, in also supporting the extension, it was my intention earlier today to seek an extension as well of the traffic ticket amnesty based on a number of calls that we have been getting, because it runs out today. But based on, we didn't sit last week, and the extension would have to be approved by both houses of the parliament before the expiry date. And so far we have collected some $471 million up to yesterday afternoon. $471 million. We have processed some 45,000 tickets. No, sorry, 168,690 tickets from 45,000 telephone calls to the call center. And therefore, I'm going to be asking my colleagues in cabinet to give consideration for an extension based on the overwhelming amount of calls to the ministry and to TAJ and to the police for an extension, because some persons are saying that they just couldn't put the funds together immediately, and we are going to be actively looking at that. So in that light, Mr. Speaker, we will be re-looking at a small extension to the ticket amnesty. But we do support the extension of the zone of special operations, and I would commend the House to do the same.
Minister, Mr. Bunting?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I had asked the Prime Minister a question when he had made his original statement on the Mount Salem ZOSO, if he could have shared what was the resource allocation required for the 60 days, both financially and manpower-wise, to maintain the Mount Salem ZOSO. You, at that time, it was obviously not settled, but I think now that you're going for the extension, you should have a fairly good handle on what it costs, or what has it cost us, manpower-wise and financial resource-wise, for the first 60 days of the Mount Salem ZOSO.
Mr. Speaker, yes, I do recall being asked the question, and I do recall also making a commitment to provide the answers. I don't have them now. I'm aware of some figures, and I don't want to say what I'm just tangentially aware of. But just to be clear, Mr. Speaker, I would ask that the House considers that these questions are sensitive and that I would be willing to provide them directly to you, but not for public consumption. Precisely, because there are some sensitive areas. Mr. Speaker, as I'm on my feet and I don't see any other member asking me to yield to them, I now ask that the motion be approved.
Before I put the motion, as a matter of the importance of this matter, I have a report, public report from Indicom, that gives full support to this operation, and that people in the area has commended the operation, and Indicom has reported positively on it. And I think that we ought to give a recognition. I noticed that the member from Westmoreland is shaking his head. In the new operation, in certain matters, the Speaker will intervene and make a presentation. Those in favor of the resolution? Those against? The ayes have it. Minister Warmington, your time.
Mr. Speaker, we now have the State of the Constituents debate, and the first... No, put it off, not today.
You wanted the mocha today. I thought you were tired and needed rest. Yeah. Okay, well, no.
All right, the member from...
I was just being generous.
The opposition spokesman and national security wants to make his contribution to the mocha debate. Mr. Speaker, we now continue the State of the Constituents debate, and the first presentation is from Honourable Delroy Chuck, Member of Parliament for North East St. Andrew. All right, he's yielding to the Member of Parliament for East Central St. Catherine? East Central St. Catherine to make his contribution.
Mr. Terilyn.
Mr. Speaker, members of this Honourable House, distinguished guests, visitors, my fellow Jamaicans watching and listening through various media, good afternoon to you all. As I rise to make my contribution to this year's State of the Constituency debate, I must thank God, firstly, for giving us an opportunity to serve the people of this great nation, and secondly, for allowing us to live in the dawn of a new era of prosperity. Prosperity for East Central St. Catherine, prosperity for Southeast St. Mary, prosperity for all Jamaicans. Mr. Speaker, this new era has been ushered in by the Jamaica Labour Party under the stewardship of our leader and Prime Minister, the Most Honourable Andrew Holness. In this new era, Mr. Speaker, Jamaica has turned her back on the wayward run-with-it days of poor, fiscal, and wild economic policies that saw her bleeding from the coffers and ran into loving arms and sweet embrace of prudent and efficient fiscal and social policies grounded in the belief, Mr. Speaker, that all Jamaicans can be empowered to climb every mountain, ford every stream, dream their impossible dreams, knowing that this administration cares about them, and is committed to securing a prosperity-filled future for us all. Mr. Speaker, I stand here because of the support of several persons. To our Prime Minister and Captain of Team Prosperity, the Most Honourable Andrew Holness, I extend my eternal gratitude, loyalty, and support for the confidence you entrusted in me by endorsing my guardianship of the constituency of East Central St. Catherine. When others doubted whether this little boy from Grand Spen, who later became an attorney at law, could have wrestled the constituency of East Central St. Catherine after 36 years of one-sided political dominance and political neglect, your belief in my ability to earn the respect and support of the constituents did not waver, and I thank you. Mr. Speaker, I must also thank my colleagues on what I dare say is the better side of the House, for their continued support, which has been invaluable. And Mr. Speaker, I must also extend my sincere thanks to the Honourable Dr. Andrew Wheatley, who mentored me and championed the defence of my capabilities to connect with Jamaicans on all levels, to remain committed to serving the people and not to quiver under the pressures of the hard work that it takes to become and to be a good member of Parliament to the people. To the people of St. Catherine East Central who elected me as their political representative, you have my unending gratitude. I assure you that I do not take this responsibility lightly, and that I remain committed to work with you, listen to your views, and ensure that together we move forward, enacting policies to move our constituency further on the path to prosperity and make East Central a beacon of hope, a developed and thriving community, perfect to live, do business, and raise families. Mr. Speaker, I must also thank the persons who truly put the political power behind me to ensure the constituency was delivered from the poor leadership after 36 years. To the delegates and party workers whose respect I earned and who in their bid to see change, to see new and effective leadership in Portmore, worked tirelessly to ensure that we were victorious at the polls, I thank you. To my team, I thank you for your continued support and commitment to ensure we deliver the best service to all residents in East Central. I make special mention of Councillor Joy Brown and Councillor Caretaker Mr. Lennox Hines, who continue to stand at my side and dedicate their lives in the service of the people of Jamaica. I must also make mention to my other team members, Mr. Marlon Gordon, my executive assistant, and Andrew Campbell, who, as my GTK family always say, give proof to the mantra that teamwork makes the dream work. Mr. Speaker, I am a better member of Parliament because of the work of my team, and I thank them. And finally, Mr. Speaker, we are all aware of the importance of family. They nurture us and make us stronger. Their sacrifice, knowing that we might not be there due to the commitment to others above self, strengthens us. It strengthens our desires to play a role in nation building. And so, Mr. Speaker, I must thank my mother and father, Calvin and Winsome, who are in the House, for raising me with a sense of love for people, country, and service to others. I must also thank my fiancée Raquel, who has been a pillar of support for me and our sons Alessandro and Athens along this path as we trod forward in prosperity. Mr. Speaker, upon becoming the Member of Parliament, the first plan of action was to meet with all the stakeholders in the constituency to get a true sense of the work that was needed to ensure we moved East Central from poverty to prosperity. And so, Mr. Speaker, we conducted a constituency evaluation and consultation process at the Cedar Grove High School, where we met with several community-based organizations, members of the Social Development Corporation, and residents. Mr. Speaker, the mission was clear. A focus on health, community development, and infrastructure. A focus on job creation. A focus on social welfare and social housing. A focus on sports, and a focus on education. Mr. Speaker, in our focus on health, our very first major project took place in May of 2016 as we bid for the National Labour Day project to take place in the constituency of East Central St. Catherine. Mr. Speaker, the National Labour Day project saw us maintaining a project which aimed at developing and cleaning two primary drains in the constituency. The drain along Washington Mews in the division of Southborough, and the drain running from Dover Avenue to Portmore Villas in the Gregory Park division. Mr. Speaker, this is of primary importance, as in 2016 we faced the threats of Chick V and Zick V, and it was incumbent upon me as the Member of Parliament to ensure that there was proper leadership in the constituency to rid the breeding sites and to limit vector control diseases in the constituency. Mr. Speaker, the National Labour Day project in East Central was successful. And we have continued with our health features, Mr. Speaker, by consistently cleaning drains and embarking on a project of debushing to ensure that mosquito breeding sites and other sites for other rodents are kept clean. Mr. Speaker, I have also been in discussions with the Minister of Health, the Honourable Christopher Tufton, as it relates to renovating and making a sincere impact on the health centre in the Christian Penn community. That health centre serves more than 10,000 persons, Mr. Speaker, and the Minister has given his commitment to ensuring that proper policies and designs are effected to move the health concerns of the residents further along the path to prosperity. And I thank the Honourable Minister. In terms of infrastructure, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, I could go on and speak of the several projects that we have embarked upon in East Central St. Catherine. I make mention of two special projects. It is a zinc removal project along Cottage Drive in the Gregory Park division, and also the zinc removal project along the Christian Gardens Main Road, also in the Gregory Park division. Mr. Speaker, as a child raised in Grants Pen, I am no stranger to the horrors of zinc and what happens behind many of them. Mr. Speaker, it is for these reasons why Councillor Joy Brown and I have embarked upon this particular project to ensure the development of the communities and the beautification, and also to instill a sense of communal pride in our residents across East Central St. Catherine. Mr. Speaker, whilst we do not have readily the resources to embark on such large-scale community development projects in other areas, Councillor Caretaker Lennox Hines has been instrumental in assisting with the delivery of more than 100 bags of cement to other residents in the Southborough division, that they too, Mr. Speaker, might remove some of the zincs that crowd their communities. We made a promise to the people whilst we campaigned and earned their respect. We promised them roads, Mr. Speaker. One community in particular, the community of Cedar Grove, has been without a proper network of roads for almost 18 years now. We promised them roads, and we have delivered upon that promise. Promise made, promise kept, Mr. Speaker. Residents of Cedar Grove now enjoy a swift drive, but safely, along Ponciana Drive. Residents in Gregory Park enjoy a swift and safe drive along Melvin Avenue, Stevens Avenue, and Hardware Avenue, all new roads built by Labour for the communities of these persons. Mr. Speaker, In the community of Newlands, we gave them Rosemary Close. In the community of Watson Grove, we gave them Aquarius Drive. In the community of Meadowvale, we gave them Cougar Drive. And Mr. Speaker, I could go on and on and on. Mr. Speaker, we have embarked on a program of social welfare and social housing that has so far seen us spend a total of $8 million, Mr. Speaker, that has been earmarked to assist constituents to improve their housing. Mr. Speaker, it is difficult for persons to take pride in themselves if they cannot first take pride in their homes. And Mr. Speaker, we have assisted several residents in renovating their homes, building bathrooms that their children can have proper sanitary facilities, Mr. Speaker. And I thank my team for their assistance in assisting with development of these projects. Mr. Speaker, we have also paid an important focus on sporting development. One of the things that we have done was to ensure that the football field in Watson Grove, Mr. Speaker, that it was leveled, that topsoil was placed upon it, Mr. Speaker, and after more than 30 years, the football in Watson Grove now has a proper course laden with grass for players to play the sport of football. We have also assisted the community of Cedar Grove with lighting for their fields, Mr. Speaker, and for the football field, and we have also committed to providing lights for their multipurpose court that residents can enjoy night football and that the young ladies can also play their netball anytime, be it day or night. Mr. Speaker, our major project in terms of sport and development has been the acquisition of land in Portmore Villas to ensure that the football teams in the Christian Penn and surrounding areas will have their own sporting facilities. And I must thank the Honourable Minister, Dr. Horace Chang, and the Honourable Minister, Mr. Darrell Vaz, for their assistance in helping these communities in the Christian Penn and wider Gregor Park to secure this piece of land which we intend to use, and we will start in December, Mr. Speaker, to lay the foundation for the multipurpose court in this new era of prosperity-filled Gregor Park that we are creating. Mr. Speaker, other sporting initiatives, we have looked at assisting sports in the high schools and in communities. We have assisted them by way of nutritional products such as Gatorade, sporting gears, Mr. Speaker. In fact, just last week, we provided football boots to the entire football at the premier center of excellence in the constituency, the Cedar Grove Academy, a donation that was well received by the football players and the students generally. Mr. Speaker, I am mindful of the time and must now embark on our most crucial area of community development, that area being education. Mr. Speaker, without educating the next generation, the people of East Central St. Catherine cannot truly trod comfortably along the path of prosperity. And so, Mr. Speaker, we have instituted a program
How much?
10. 5.
That's it.
No, man, it's
So, but he has 15 minutes and it's go.
Give me 5. I donate 5.
Mr.
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
Member from East Central St. Catherine.
Oh.
Mr. Terilyn, member from East Central St. Catherine, I'll just allow you to wrap up your
Yes, thank you, sir. On this very important topic of education. Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, for the last 3 years, we have embarked on a program aimed at ensuring that our GSAT students across the constituency get the very best from their Member of Parliament and his team. We conduct GSAT motivational speeches. We also provided all 650 students sitting GSAT across the constituency with their stationery to ensure that no child is left behind. Mr. Speaker, of importance this year, we partnered with our friends from Proven Investment Limited, Lasco, Kingston Bookshop to also ensure that each of the 650 students sitting GSAT were served with breakfast both on the Thursday and Friday morning. No child must be left behind. Mr. Speaker, with assistance from Supreme Ventures, we are also able to sponsor the Gregory Park Baptist Church Life Center for Lifelong Learning with a donation in excess of $130,000 towards providing stationery and other materials so that persons who are not successful in their CXCs and adults might also have a place that they can return and get a proper education. Mr. Speaker, this year in particular, we supported more than 4,000 students by way of scholarships, bursaries, vouchers, and school supplies to ensure that they went to schools. This was from primary education, kindergarten, and also university students. Mr. Speaker, I'm also happy to announce that our primary focus has also been on creating the Terilyn Award for Excellence, which we give to the top 10 schools from each primary school. Mr. Speaker, I am mindful of the time, and I must only add finally, Mr. Speaker, that prosperity means different things to different people. To the young man from Nagahead Primary who earned his place at Campion College, it means knowing that his future from a volatile community of Newlands is better secured with a full scholarship from the Member of Parliament. To the young lady, Annalise Nolan from Walker's Avenue, a harsh community in Gregory Park, knowing that she did well coming from the Gregory Park Primary and received a full scholarship to Immaculate Conception from the Member of Parliament is prosperity to her and her family. To the residents in other communities, Mr. Speaker, who now have proper roads to trod, no more dust, no more asthma, that is prosperity for them. Mr. Speaker, to many others across the constituency, just being able to have the listening ear of the Member of Parliament and to receive assistance, knowing that the Member of Parliament has the full backing of the government of Jamaica, is prosperity to all. Promises made, promises kept, Mr. Speaker, and we thank you.
Mr. Campbell.
Mr. Speaker, first I want to ask for permission to speak from a seat other than yes.
You are permitted, sir.
At the outset, Mr. Speaker, I just want to acknowledge you for the times that you have deputized in that chair. I think you have been fair in your handling of the House, the affairs of the House. And I also want to acknowledge my colleagues and friends that exist inside of the chamber and outside. But I really want to say that I give thanks to, first and foremost, my Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, for his continued guidance and protection over my life. And I also want to say thanks to my family. They often give the most by just giving of their loved ones to serve in this process that can be rewarding and can be one that is seen as ungrateful at times. And I encourage colleagues as well to ensure that they don't forget them, because they're really special ones to us, and they allow us to be who we are. I also want to acknowledge the members of the constituency of Northwestern St. Anne who continue to vote for me and send me to the Houses of Parliament. And they have done so. That's one more than you, Floyd. They have done so before, Mr. Speaker, and they will do so again. At the outset, though, Mr. Speaker, having gone into the constituency, one of the first things that you try to do is to look at the community development profile. so you can have an understanding as to what the issues affecting the residents are, and so that you can put forward some plans that will not only meet the ideas of grandeur that you may have for the area, but that will incorporate the views of the people. And so having looked at the community development profile and looked at the areas that they want to see the focus on, infrastructure is at the top of it in relation to roads, potable water in some of the communities, electricity in some, community centers, and just sporting facilities in other areas. Education was the next issue, healthcare, and then after that you had employment and just youth activities. The point I want to make, though, I believe, Mr. Speaker, that for the most part members of Parliament are given a very difficult hand, because the fact of the matter is that everybody in the constituency is holding you accountable for all sorts of development within the constituency, and you're given very limited resources on which to implement anything at all. The idea and the concept of having the Constituency Development Fund was and still remains a very good idea. And, Mr. Speaker, I'm wondering if the time has not come for us as a parliament to look at the Constituency Development Fund and to say that we need to increase it in a meaningful way so that you can empower the members of parliament that when they are elected and they are being charged to develop a community, that they have it within their capabilities to do so. I really believe that the CDF should be increased exponentially. For instance, when the persons in communities are complaining about roads, a CDF of $20 million for the entire financial year cannot really make any meaningful contribution towards fixing roads. When persons complain about having potable water in their communities, the CDF that is limited at $20 million really cannot do that. And I know that some of the media houses may run with a headline to say that I'm asking for politicians to have more direct control over the spending of resources. But these same media houses that will speak against that argument are the same ones that run to a roadblock and then put the member of parliament on the spot to say that he or she has not done anything to fix the problem in that area. So I really believe that the Constituency Development Fund needs to be increased exponentially so that each financial year member of parliament can target some projects and get some things done. We have seen where there's a level of apathy in the society, and it is growing because persons are not seeing exactly what they're voting for in some instances. Because when you represent a rural constituency, it is much different from representing a constituency in Kingston and St. Andrew. And you will understand that, Mr. Speaker, the $20 million for the Constituency Development Fund and the $10 million for Jeep, what it represents to somebody who is in Kingston who can ride around their constituency in a day or who can walk out their constituency in a day, it does not represent that for somebody who is from rural Jamaica, which will take them more than a week to walk one division. And so it is very important that we look at this issue in a real way so that we can empower persons, and then they will be held accountable by those who elect them. The fact of the matter is that currently it is difficult to say you're going to hold a member of parliament accountable for the things within his area if you're not his or her area, if you have not given them the resources to do so. And politics is cyclical. Now you will have one party in power. It won't stay that way forever. It will change, and then the next party will get a chance to govern because of the nature of politics. And so what we ought to do is to ensure that we put something in place so that every member that is elected to this House can make the necessary representation for the persons that send them here. I want to be able, Mr. Speaker, to be able to walk into the division of Bamboo and say to the residents that I'm going to fix the Philadelphia Road, and knowing that I can allocate $15 or $20 million from the Constituency Development Fund and they can get their road done. If we're not at that stage, I still believe that we have approached this in a piecemeal way. And I think that we can do a little bit more to ensure that we empower the individual members. Because The sad reality of it is that the party that is in power, their members have greater access to resources, and so it is much easier. And the statements that were made in the campaign is exactly what will happen, is that those who are closer to the administration will have a greater opportunity. But, Mr. Speaker, from my experience over on that side, some of you who sit further away from the front will still have a similar experience in that it becomes difficult to get things done within your constituency, and persons are saying, but we voted for you. How is it that you cannot fix this road? How is it that you cannot fix this minor water supply? So I really think that we need to empower the persons, give them the responsibility and the ability to do something about it so that they can be held accountable. And I really believe, Mr. Speaker, wholeheartedly, that that is something that we must look at. We cannot keep distributing the Jeep in a way where we are thinking about equity, in that we give 10 or it's probably not equity, it's more of equality, where we give $10 million to each constituency equally. Because the problem is that they vary in size, and they also vary in shape, right? In shapes, because some of the constituencies, you can literally get through it in half a day. The amount of road that they have to develop in that constituency is much different from those in the rural areas. The member from Northwest St. Elizabeth, I'm quite sure that he can understand the point that I'm making, that the roadway that you will have, and from South Trelawney, the roadway that you will have in your constituency in rural Jamaica is not the same thing. So for us to be giving $10 million to everyone equally, the distribution there is unequal because the constituency size varies. There are constituencies that have 17,000. There are constituencies that have 18,000 members. And there are constituencies that have 40,000 members. Central Westmoreland and Northeast St. Anne have 40,000 constituents. So it makes absolutely no sense in my mind for us to be given the same allocation to these constituencies. And I think that it is something that we need to look at, and it's something that we need to change. And oftentimes, Mr. Speaker, you hear the excuse that that is what the rule is or that is what the law is. Well, we are lawmakers. We come here, and if there's a problem with the law, then we are to amend it so that we can deliver the proper representation and policies to the people of this country. Because if we're not doing that, then it will be difficult to convince me that what we're doing here is not a waste of time if we cannot deliver effective representation to those who send us here. Mr. Speaker, we also need to ensure that projects that are started before do not become victim of a change in government. Because the truth be told is that in these constituencies, when we conceptualize a project, it is not just one party that has supporters within that area. So, for instance, you have a health center that we're trying to get in Runaway Bay. The Runaway Bay area is probably the fastest growing area along the north coast there. And the fact is that the health center that is there has outgrown its relevance. The dockets take up the majority of the space within the health center. You have occasions when you have antenatal clinic, when the pregnant females come to the clinic, and it is raining and they're outside standing under trees in the rain. We took the decision that we wanted to build a health center. We went through the pains of getting the job, getting the piece of land. The design was done to get the facility up and running. NHF came, they broke ground, and they said that we're going to build this health center because it is well needed in this area. Since the change of administration, it has been 19 months, and this project that should have been completed has not started. Now, Mr. Speaker, the people who are going to the antenatal clinic and just seeking health care in Runaway Bay, they are not doing so through a particularly colored lens. They are doing so because they are in need of health care. Some of them support one side, some support the other, some don't support any at all. Because to be frank, in some of our constituencies, the turnout is even less than 50%. So when we are sabotaging somebody because of a party that they support, we are end up sabotaging 75%. The that there is sabotage. No, the perception. I don't want to be controversial with this because I really think that I retract the comment, the perception that the thing is being sabotaged, Mr. Speaker. If it is that you have a constituency where only 50% of the persons are turning out, and they're already this great level of apathy because of these very same practices. I'm saying that the persons who are seeking health care, the persons who are in runaway Bay and surrounding communities, they don't care about which political party that is in power when they are sick and they're trying to get care. They want to get that care. Now, if it is that the minister is saying that he can only focus on one project at a time, then he can make that admission. But I'm suggesting to him that there is a great need for the project to be done. We went through all of the hard work, identifying the land, doing the design, and identifying the funding. All it needed to be all that needed to have been done at that time was to tender the project so that it can start, and persons would have been benefiting. The second one was a public beach for the Salem area. Since the change of administration, that project has also been shelved. The third one, we had a fire at a school in Dumbarton. The school was burnt, and we had to move the students down to Discovery Bay. The chase came, broke ground, committed funds that they were going to rebuild the school. Since the change, nothing has been done. This is the future of our nation that we're playing with. And I am asking that we remove the politics from these projects and we do the projects irrespective of which side the person is on because of the value that it will add to the community. The next thing is that we need to rethink the partnership that was established between the Parliament, the government of Jamaica, and the Food for the Poor, where we build 20 indigent houses per year, is something that was not enough, but it was making a great impact by giving housing to some of our persons, the persons living in the society. You know, one of the funniest things, Mr. Speaker, is that most of the times, the very people who run behind us and support us that we can get here, when they are on the campaign trail, the opponent, and it happens with both sides, one of the first things that they said to them is that you're running behind politics and you don't live anywhere. Because truth be told is that majority of them, they live in deplorable conditions. And this was a project that at least you could identify and give 20 of them, 20 persons, whether or not they support, but 20 persons who are in need. You could give them these houses per year. I think the decision should have been to increase the allocation to 40 per year. But instead, we have totally scrapped the project, and now there is nothing that can be meted out to those persons so that they can receive the housing within their communities. We have to change the way we are practicing the politics. The next issue, Mr. Speaker, and I'll use the time to wrap up as was done by the previous member because I learned quickly. He didn't ask for permission, he just wrap up. Right.
You may wrap up, Mr. Member from
yes.
North.
I'll use the balance of the time to wrap up. But all is not lost, Mr. Speaker. All is not lost. Because despite the challenges, despite the resource constraints and limitations, we've still been able to do some things. And I'll just mention a few of them. Since this term, I'm not talking my previous term, since this term, we have been able to partner with the Food for the Poor, and we have constructed 6 infant schools, or infant departments in our schools within Northwestern Center. We've also allocated resources to complete 4 community centers, because those who know of me would know of my Second Chance initiative. And we're using these centers to offer the skills training so that these persons don't have to spend the resources to move and to travel, because we have realized over time that when persons have to spend money to travel to the facility, that their attendance tends to fall off as the course continues. So we have tried to do community-based training by building these community centers. We have also, Mr. Speaker, been able to continue our healthcare program, where I do a mobile medical clinic, going into the different communities, attending to the residents, seeing them for free, doing their necessary checks, writing their prescriptions, signing up to NHF and JADEP so they can get their medication at a reduced cost. Because there are way too many persons within our society, especially males, who are afraid of seeking medical care. they will stay home until they are almost dying before they decide to take a decision to go to the hospital. So what we have sought to do is to take the care to them. And by just doing that, you would be surprised the number of persons we have identified who are hypertensive, who are diabetic, and they had no knowledge of it until you went there to do the screening for them. Mr. Speaker, it would also be very interesting if you would educate more of our people so that they can know that those persons who are hypertensive or diabetic, that if they are signed up to the NHF or to the JADET program, that the amount of money they spend for their medication on a monthly basis will drastically be reduced. Some of them are spending less than $100 for a full month's supply of medication once they have these cards. So this is something that the government is doing that is good, and I think it is something that we need to sign up more persons so they can benefit. The final thing, Mr. Speaker, is the issue of education. We cannot move persons from poverty to prosperity by saying it. The vehicle for upward social mobility is education. That is the way we are going to change the lives of people. That is the way we are going to give persons an opportunity as a politician, something that we can't take back from them. And that's why we have focused on education. What have we done? We have done our CSET, our GSAT classes. All the students in the constituency who have GSAT can go to the classes for free. This is something we've been doing for the last 5 years. We've done our CSET classes, offering math and English and POB. These students, some of them are in high school, some of them would have come upon harder times. Some of them are teenagers, females who got pregnant in school, who dropped out, who now have an opportunity to go back and to do a subject or two. We have as well the Second Chance Initiative, which is giving a second chance to so many of these youngsters that we call unattached. We have attached them to something so that they can be trained. They have been trained now in 15 areas. We have persons training in the hospitality areas. We have persons that we are training in the health sector areas. We have persons that we are training in more technical things because we found that the males were still shying away from the hospitality area. So we had to come with automotive mechanic, with plumbing, and with woodwork so that more males would be interested in becoming a part of the program. What we've done is to train them, certify them, and we have thus far trained and certified over 2,000 young persons so they can go out and now become proud as an employee. They can earn, they can save. Some of them can pay their NHT contribution, they can get a house, but we have changed their life from just sitting down where there was no solution in mind for them to the point now where they are empowered and they can go out there and get a job. And the final thing is that we've also done classes for adults, numeracy and literacy. And we've also done our top achiever function, which awards the top boy and girl from all 27 schools within the constituency. We have awarded top boy and girl, and we've added the top boy and girl who is on the PATH program. Because, Mr. Speaker, poverty should never be a shackle to hold somebody in poverty. We have to ensure that we make a clear call that education is a redemptive tool, irrespective of where you're coming from. And some of those students who are on PATH may not have gotten 90 because, to be frank, what I see where some people are able to send their children to evening class and to weekend classes, for most of us, the people that we represent, those students have to come home and go and do something. They have to come home, some of them have to go to the farm, some of them have to take care of other siblings. There are several other things that they have to do. So they make... Yes. Yes. Pinch, leave an inch. Right. So Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, finally, Mr. Speaker, I believe that the opportunity to serve is really a privilege, and I believe that it is something that we need to always be appreciative of, and something that we must always work overtime to try and ensure that we leave our constituents and our constituency in a better state than we found it. Thank you. May God bless you.
Mr. Hutchins.
think so too.
Mr. Speaker, Northwest St. Elizabeth, two of the major problems in the constituency over the years are the poor road conditions, especially the farm road network and the lack of pipe water. Under successive PNP administration, not even one road was rehabilitated, despite my requesting, begging, cajoling, and beseeching of the ministers. In 2010, the roads from Mocha to Springfield and Carisbrook to Lacovia were rehabilitated. No road work repairs was done between 2011 to 2016. As a matter of fact, in 2015, I tabled questions directed to then Minister of Works regarding road rehabilitation for Northwest St. Elizabeth. His frank response was captured in the Daily Gleaner of October 18, 2015. No road rehabilitation for Northwest St. Best. And see it here, no road rehabilitation for Northwest St. Best. Hutchinson cries victimization. See it there? But Mr. Speaker, but there is a silver lining behind every dark cloud. And I am pleased to report that since June 2016, some asphalting has been done on 12 parish council roads. And two major roadways are currently being rehabilitated. At last, the middle quarters to New Market Road is being repaired at last. Therefore, the residents will no longer see the need to start a banana plantation on the roadway. The Arcadia to Magati Road is also under rehabilitation. When completed, these roads will allow residents to travel more easily and comfortably across the constituency, ensuring that farmers can move their produce quicker and in a better condition, enabling them to move from poverty to prosperity. I'm pleased also to report that NWC has now come on board to provide pipe water to a significant portion of the New Market Division. The NWC is currently laying pipes to supply pipe waters to New Market, Louisville, Prospect, Bloomsbury, Brighton, Content, and surrounding areas. The children will not be left out, Mr. Speaker. What we are doing is that prosperity is going into the school garden and breakfast program, which was launched in the constituency. Under this initiative, the primary schools were given inputs to establish school gardens. Some 13 schools have benefited. As part of this initiative, the schools as well as farmers groups will be able to utilize the agro-processing facility or incubator located at the Rada Parish Office in Santa Cruz. They are able to make juice, puree, jams, jellies, etc., especially for the breakfast program. We intend to eliminate the bag juice being offered in the schools. "42 persons between the ages of 18 and 24 were given a 4-week training by RADA during the summer in all areas of extension service. This is to prepare them to be agricultural aides, one being in every district. Mr. Speaker, the constituency of Northwest St. Elizabeth is the major agricultural producing constituency in the parish of St. Elizabeth and by extension in the island, and that is verified by the parish manager. The crops vary from tree crops
to yam, Irish potato, pineapple, dasheen, and most of the other cash crops produced. These small farmers have shown their resilience to the vagrancies of the weather and have even multiplied their output in recent times. Mr. Speaker, however, for them to get the optimum yields from their crops, there are challenges at times, with a lack of finances to purchase the inputs necessary or at the required time. There are also problems with marketing their crops most times. To overcome these problems, I have started an agriculture push start program, APS, with 2 crops, Irish potato and Scotch bonnet pepper. Since the constituency is one which is part of the breadbasket. The program is one where I have asked a number of agricultural input suppliers to partner with RADA to provide the seeds, fertilizer, and chemicals up front to the farmers. All the farmers have to do is to get the land prepared and put in their labor. A contract price is agreed to between farmer and the purchaser of the produce. At the time of purchase, the cost of the inputs are deducted and the farmer is given his profit. Mr. Speaker, we must no longer have a decline in any quarter in the agricultural sector. This program is one way of providing inputs directly to the farmers through the agricultural organizations within the districts. And I'm pleased to know that the input suppliers are also encouraging the formation of these organizations so there can be better accountability and transparency in all areas of the sector. Data has shown that when inputs are channeled directly to these organizations, there is a spike in production. Agriculture has to be treated as a business. And I seriously believe that we must eliminate the handouts and the gimme mentality that persists. Our country cannot grow if this sort of culture is maintained. In Northwest St. Elizabeth, there are 32 registered organizations from as far back as 2008. Contrary to what others may imply. For the record, Mr. Speaker, I want to read into the record here the Rural Agricultural Development Authority Act, 1990. And it says, and I quote, "In the exercise of its function under Section 1, the authority may A, carry on such activities as appear to be advantageous, necessary, or desirable for or in connection with the performance of those functions, including without prejudice to the generality of the foregoing, the marketing of agricultural produce. B, promote the carrying on of any such activities as aforesaid by other bodies or persons and or for that purpose may, 1, establish or expand or promote the establishment or expansion of other bodies to carry on those activities, whether or not under the control or partial control of the authority, and 2, give assistance to such bodies or persons." Mr. Speaker, this is the hub for the growth in the agricultural sector. The RADA Act clearly indicates that the authority may establish or expand or promote other bodies. This is to assist in the efficient operation of the organization, especially with the visioned development of the agricultural sector. One such body is the PMOs, Production and Marketing Organizations. In Northwest St. Elizabeth, they are a permanent structure. And in the constituency or anywhere else in this island, I am prepared to have any or all of the generals investigate the operations of the PMOs. Mr. Speaker, I am recommending that the rural MPs who are able to identify unused government lands in their constituencies or persons with private land that may grow Irish potato, onion, or Scotch bonnet pepper use some of their CDF allocation to bring your farmers into this agricultural push start program, and the funds be used as a revolving program. This program is set to benefit all farmers throughout the island for these 3 crops as a pilot. This is going to be a game changer for agriculture in Jamaica and the start of establishing a structured agricultural sector and providing the growth necessary to drive the economy. Crops such as tomato, carrot, gungo peas, thyme, cantaloupe, and other crops are being imported into the island. Next year, I intend to bring some of these crops under the program so we can eliminate the importation of most of them. Some of the other crops being looked into for the programs are ginger, pineapple, turmeric, strawberry, sweet potato, dasheen, and most of these are grown in Northwest St. Elizabeth. I have to once again thank the private sector companies who are partnering with RADA in this program to assist farmers in their agricultural pursuits. This shows the level of commitment and confidence these companies have in the farmers of this country. Mr. Speaker, for agriculture in Jamaica to be competitive, we have to seek modern equipment for the sector. To this end, I would like to thank Propel for providing a potato planter and reaper and an onion planter for the farmers, especially those on small plots of land. Months ago, I had demonstrations done by drones highlighting their versatility and how they could assist farmers in increasing their production and productivity. I am pleased to announce that the Netherlands will be providing RADA with a drone to assist in its extension work. This drone will cost the ministry 300,000 Jamaican dollars, which represents 40% of the total cost, the balance being borne by Netherlands Center for Tropical Agriculture. This drone will be able to provide RADA with more accurate production data, identify more accurately and expeditiously crop damage after a national disaster, even in remote areas or areas which are inaccessible. It will also be able to identify crops which lack various nutrients or tree crops that have disease that are not visible from the ground. Mr. Speaker, in closing, the Agricultural Push Start program is concentrating on youth and women, but it also embraces all agricultural entrepreneurs who have a passion for and are serious about agriculture. It therefore provides for food security, opportunities to better provide for self and family, social empowerment, rural development, curtails the urban drift and creates employment, thereby facilitating persons transitioning from poverty to prosperity. Mr. Speaker, this program is targeting a 20% growth in the agricultural sector next year. I am pleased to advise that the Shadow Minister fully supports the program and will now continue to do so for many years as Shadow Minister. I say to all farmers, come on board. You could not have it any better. Let us all as stakeholders play our part in growing the agricultural production in our country as we move towards self-sufficiency and greater food security, and by expanding the value chain, thereby joining in the mantra of grow what you eat what you can, and can what you can't. In doing so, prosperity will be ours, it being a done deal. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Mr. Speaker, I ask for the suspension of the constituency debate until next Tuesday, the 7th.
Yes. Chip to Joe. Those in favor? Those in favor? Those against? Ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker is not intending to do any further business for the day, so I ask for the House to be adjourned until 2 p.m. next week, November 7th at 2 p.m.
The motion is that the House be now adjourned until next Tuesday, on the 7th, at 2 p.m. Those in favor? Aye. Those opposed? The ayes have it. This Honourable House now stands adjourned.
As an inner city youth, I'm a duty for know my rights. Not because you see me on the